Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I have a very special guest today, Vanessa. She is the author of the Latinx Guide to Liberation. There we go. It's beautiful. It's purple. So, Vanessa, I know I said I sort of introduced you, but who are you? Why are you here? What's going on?
Hi, Nicole. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Vanessa Pezo, and I'm the author of the Latinx Guide to Liberation, Healing from Historical, Generational, and Individual Trauma, which is a book that comes out February 21st, 2025. Very exciting. Aside from that, I am actually a trauma therapist, and I'm based in Long Beach, California. This is my first book, and so it's a really exciting time. And that's a little bit about me.
Yes. Oh, awesome. So, where did you grow up, and what was that journey getting to writing this book?
I was born in East LA, California. So if anyone's kind of familiar with that neighborhood of Los Angeles, it's like a very Mexican Chicano area. It's actually where my mom is from, and my mom was born there as well. And so all of my family basically is there or very close to there. So I spent a lot of my childhood there. But when I was in around like second grade, my parents were able to buy their first home, and they moved us about 30 miles east to a place called Chino, California, which is the Inland Empire. Maybe you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
So I went from a very Mexican Chicano area where everybody was pretty much like me. And all of a sudden I was with my family, and we were in this very kind of like white, almost rural community. There's a lot of dairy farms there back in the day. And so I went through a bit of a culture shock because I had never been in a community like that before.
Yeah.
And I basically spent the rest of my like childhood into my teen years kind of going back and forth between these two communities. And it felt like traveling between two different worlds, honestly. And that experience has definitely shaped a lot of my outlook.
Yeah, especially also you went from a city life, and East LA could also feel a little condensed, right? You are constantly seeing people on the streets, and so you're so used to just that energy of different people around, to moving to a very rural area, like you said, and almost like the burbs, where it's very much like everyone just goes to their home and sort of isolates themselves a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I remember asking my mom, like, where's the ice cream truck? Like, it hasn't passed. Because I was so used to the ice cream truck or the elotero or, whoever walking by and the bells and stuff. Now I'd be like waiting in the driveway, like, when are they going to pass? I want to buy an ice cream. And it's just quiet and there's nobody. And it was so weird.
Yeah. Did you stay in LA? I know you went to CSU Long Beach. So did you just constantly stay in LA, or did you move somewhere and then come back? How did that come?
I moved around a little bit. So after high school, I went to community college, which was at Citrus College, which is in Glendora. So that's kind of like the foothill areas of Los Angeles. And I did my AA there. And then after that, I transferred to UC San Diego. So I was in San Diego for 2 years, and I did my bachelor's there. So my degree was in international studies with an emphasis on sociology and Latin America. So kind of one of those degrees where you can kind of mix different disciplines.
Yeah.
I did that. And then after that, I moved to Long Beach, which is where I've been ever since, which is a place I love living. It's so diverse here. I love living in Long Beach. And I worked here for a couple of years, and eventually I did my master's at Cal State Long Beach in social work.
Okay. Yeah. Cause I'm like, I know I read Long Beach somewhere. There we go. Yeah. And shout out to community college. That's where I started off too. I went to community college in San Jose and then transferred to San Francisco State. So I feel like nowadays, I do believe more people are going to probably start going to community college first, because college is just kind of really expensive. So, hey, I love that.
I definitely encourage people to do the community college route. You save yourself so much money, and it kind of gives you time to get used to like college life and college classes before you jump into the 4-year university.
Yeah, it's like the training wheels, I feel like, also of adulthood. You're not being pushed into adulthood so quickly. You get to like take your time. I love that. All right. So you graduated with your master's, and then you started your work as a trauma therapist from there, or did you try other forms of therapy, mental health, before you decided to land where you landed?
I got really interested in trauma work while I was in my graduate program. And so I started actually trauma therapy while I was still in my master's program. So you do internships as an MSW. Part of the program is you do an internship each year. And so I actually was able to do an internship my second year at the Long Beach Trauma Recovery Center. And that's a place where people can come and they can get free counseling if they have experienced any type of like trauma or crime. And so I was really able to dive into it there. We got a lot of training on how to treat traumatic stress and kind of the different modalities. And I've basically been focused on trauma ever since. I was always really attracted to it because I liked the idea of like mental health is something that is not necessarily always just like innate, right? Like you aren't necessarily just born like depressed or anxious, that it's a reaction to some of the stuff that we go through. So I felt like it was less like stigmatizing, or it wasn't as pathologizing to say, you know, I've had these experiences and that's why I feel this way. So to me, it felt very like affirming. And I liked that kind of relationship of how to understand mental health.
Yeah. So was that the beginning of what inspired you to write this book? Why this type of book right now for you?
Yeah, I think it was definitely part of the influence of writing this book. With that, the Long Beach Trauma Recovery Center, we worked with like such a diverse range of clients. And so you really do get to see a lot of different types of trauma and the different ways people are impacted by trauma. But I'll say what really was like the catalyst to writing the book was when I started to actually get bigger on TikTok. So a couple of years ago, I started making TikToks about trauma, but I was talking about specifically like Latinx mental health. And I was surprised, honestly, when some of those videos really like blew up and I was getting a lot of comments and a lot of people were reaching out to me and people were really resonating with this information that was specific to them.
Yeah.
And so people would basically say like, where can I learn more about this? Or what, like, are there any books you can recommend? And, people wanted to be able to read and learn and understand. And I would be able to say like, well, this book kind of talks about it, but it's like, it talks about it for everybody. Or like this research article talks about it, but it's kind of academic, right? And not everyone has access to academic journals. Or this book talks about it, but it's like a mental health textbook. And so that's not necessarily something everybody just wants to pick up and read.
Yeah.
And I realized like there's not really a book that's for Latinos that's about mental health that is specific to us and that's written just for like a general audience, like not for therapists, not for academics, but like just for people to understand what their mental health is like and also some of the stuff that's maybe unique to us as a culture or as a group.
Yeah. And that's something I got from your book. There is a lot of research into it. So even if you are not Latinx, you don't identify as Latino, there is a lot of history. And so I almost like my dad was a history teacher. I'm a big history buff. I looked at it. When I was reading it, I was also reading it from like a historical lens. I'm like, wow, this is like a lot of interesting information. And just like, I was highlighting, I was like, oh, I need to like research that a little bit more and that a little bit more, like just the whole colonization and all of that. So if you aren't like thinking like you don't want to read a book about like trauma or something, there's a lot of historical information in this. I think just would enlighten a lot of people of just the history of like human beings, basically, and how certain countries formed and the people that live in those countries. So I got a good like education from it in the first like few chapters. I was like, oh, this is a lot.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think that's something that maybe people wouldn't expect from a book that's more on like mental health and trauma, but I really think it's important like to give a full story and to understand like the context things happen in, right? So if we're having mental health struggles, it's not just that it's this individual person who's having a problem because there's something wrong with them, right? Like it happens because of all of these other outside forces. And so if we're talking about Latinos, I think it's really important for us to know our history and to understand what we've gone through as a people.
Yeah, exactly. So I know this wasn't in the list of questions I sent you, but we keep using the word trauma. So can you tell our audience what is your definition of what trauma is.
Yeah. So my definition of trauma is basically it can be an event, it could be a series of events, it could be a set of circumstances that has happened to an individual, a family, a group, a community, a culture, a people that has been harmful. And that could be emotionally harmful, it could be physically harmful, it could be spiritually harmful. And basically, it overwhelms that person or group's ability to cope with it. And it has long lasting effects. And so, a lot of times, I think when people think about trauma, they think about, like, I got in a car accident and that was traumatic, or I got robbed on the street and that was traumatic. And of course, that kind of stuff is traumatic.
Mhm.
And also, it's a lot more than that, right? It's about some of the other things that we go through, not just individually, but as communities and as groups of people
Yeah.
that have a long lasting impact on us.
Mm. Yeah, I really enjoyed that in your book and just hearing your definition as well. I think when we think of trauma, I do agree. People think something big has to happen and then their traumatic response to that. But it could be a lot of little things that just build up, and or unsaid things in the family. One of my friends once said, like, all the open secrets in the family, that those could be traumatic. And it
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily mean like this big horrific thing has to happen to you. It's the little unspoken things that maybe just sort of get to like underneath, get to the roots of you and just sort of give you this like response to trauma.
Mhm.
So speaking of the book, what were some of the hard parts to write about? Because while reading this, I was just thinking, I'm like, you're giving us such like probably a small thing of all the research you've done. And this can be like the research itself and everything you're learning is can be very triggering, can be very traumatic. And so what were some of the hardest parts for you to write about or research about?
I noticed the chapter that I really struggled with, and I think kind of took me some time, like to start and then reset and then start and reset, was chapter 5, which is called Soul Wounds. And so
Mm,
this is a chapter that talks about the impact of historical trauma on our mental health. So the chapters leading up to that do kind of talk about like colonization, and they talk about some of the systems of oppression. And so it felt like with this chapter, it was like I kind of needed to put it all together and explain this is why this stuff matters and how it impacts your mental health. And that's a really big topic. And I
yeah.
wanted it to be clear, right? I wanted it to be concise. And I also didn't want it to be shaming. Like, there's so much stigma already around mental health. So I never wanted to send the message of like, because I've gone through these things and because my family and previous generations have gone through things, there's something wrong with us, or we're sick in some way, or we're disordered in some way. And a lot of mental health language sounds that way, right? Like if someone tells you you have a mental health disorder, it makes it sound like there's something wrong with you. And so it took me a while to find the words and to be really clear about the fact that there's nothing wrong with us. These are normal and expected reactions to going through such intense, significant historical events. What's wrong and what's sick is these historical events, things like colonialism and racism and capitalism and all the things that come with it. We are
Mhm.
just human beings that are, of course, impacted by it. And these are some of the ways that's going to show up. And so once I found that flow, I was able to really get into it and write it. But I was really, kind of struggling in the beginning to figure out how I could say that in a way that came across the way I wanted it to come across.
Yeah. Yeah. That was I remember reading that chapter and yeah, I did go from like all this history to like, okay, let's like sum it up. And it's like, ooh, and
Mhm.
I loved that term soul wounds. I was like, oh yeah, like this is you could go around like being really confident outwardly, but you still are struggling with this wound because of everything that's happened to your group of people for so long, the oppression and the colonization that it's just like, oh, like there's this heaviness that's still like always there. So yeah. Um, I guess I'm also curious to know, like, how long did it take you to research this book? Like, because there's a lot of information.
Yeah.
And so what was that process like? Was it like a year of research and then writing? What was that going on?
The process of reading and researching and writing was I kind of did it simultaneously. I mean, a lot of these topics are things that I've researched before, maybe because I've done like certain trainings or I've done certain talks or I've made like content on my social media about it. And so I had kind of like a core foundation of information and things that I could draw from. But then once I started writing, there's always like more that you can add and more detail and things like that. And so basically, I would kind of set aside like however many days a week I could work on the book.
Mhm.
And my focus would be okay, I'm going to do a little bit of reading just to kind of get in the flow of things. But I had to put a time limit on it because I can get really lost in the reading and the
Yeah.
research.
Yeah.
And then I would just have to start writing. And so I would
Okay.
have a general outline and I would kind of start writing. And then as I needed, I would research as I went along. And so that kind of felt best for me, just because if not, I could spend a lot of time in my comfort zone, which is reading and research, and then
Mhm.
avoid the part that is a little bit harder and a little bit more stressful sometimes, which is actually like putting words on a page.
Yeah. So speaking of the writing process, did you have an editor or a friend that maybe was like a second pair of eyes? Did you send it to an agent, a publisher first? What was that? How did that look like for you?
I had an editor through my publisher, but they were very like empowering. They basically said, "This is your book. You're the expert. We are not mental health professionals. And so, you can send us things and of course we'll look over them and we'll give you ideas of how to like clean things up, but the content is yours," which I appreciated and also sometimes felt like a huge responsibility, right? Like you kind of do need different types of feedback. So they were great in things of like thinking about how long sentences and paragraphs were and kind of organizing and things like that. And then as far as content, I would send certain stuff. Like I had my husband read some stuff. I had my sister Bianca read some stuff, and she was really great. I had like different friends and things that would take little pieces and kind of give me their feedback or how it landed for them. And so
Mhm.
that was a really important part too, to just kind of see like, does this make sense when other people read it? And is it coming across the way I think it does, or I hope it does?
Mhm. Yeah. So did you just go straight to a publisher first, or how did this that come about?
So the publisher actually approached me about it.
Oh,
So, yeah, my editor, Steven, with Jessica Kingsley Publishers, reached out to me. He had seen a couple of the TikToks I had done that were about like
mhm,
Latinx mental health and oppression in mental health, and basically said, I really think that the content of these videos is good and I like the way you explain things. Have you ever thought about writing a book? And I had, of course, like that's a dream to write a
mhm.
book. But, there's things sometimes that we don't know if we're ready for them or not. And so
Yeah.
that seemed like a more far off goal. Um, However, the year that he reached out to me, I had told myself that was my year of yes. So if there was any opportunities that came my way, I was just going to say yes to things and see what happened because I wanted
Mhm.
to kind of open myself up to opportunities. And so I had that bit of like self-doubt, but I thought, well, let me just take this meeting and see what happens. And so I met with him. He kind of explained to me the process of putting together a book proposal and how they went about it on their end. So I thought,
Mhm.
okay, well, I'll just put the book proposal together. And if it doesn't work or if they don't want it, then that's what happens. Right now, I'll just at least know more about the process. And so I put the proposal together and he presented it to his group of editors that kind of reads through those things and makes those decisions. And everybody was really excited about it. And they said that they wanted to move forward and it kind of just took off from there.
Awesome. I love that. I love when things just sort of come together, like the book was meant to be. So, out of all the research that you've done, um, for this book, right? So you're learning. What was like something that took you by surprise in your research? What was something that you thought you knew, but maybe didn't really know the whole story?
Mhm. I think for me, what took me by surprise, and it was one of the reasons why I made a point to really spend time on it, was some of the stuff around colonialism.
Mhm.
So when I was preparing to write this book, I revisited some of the other books that I had or things I hadn't quite read that I wanted to. And there's this book called Open Veins of Latin America. And
Mhm.
it talks about the colonization of Latin America and how much wealth was actually extracted from Latin America and given to Europe. And that was really shocking to me.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to make sure that I included that because I think that we are so undervalued as a people
Mhm.
and we are looked at and stereotyped in so many different ways. And so for me to know that so much of the wealth of the world is
Mhm.
basically stolen from Latin America really
Yeah.
shifted my perspective on certain things. And I was like, I really want people to know that. And so that was something that I remember being really surprised. I wanted to come across of like how much gold, how much silver, how much wealth was taken. And
Mhm.
basically that like Europe and the capitalist system of today would not have been possible if they hadn't taken all of that from our ancestors.
Yeah. That was a fun fact for me to learn too. I mean, not so fun, but to know that so much, silver and gold were taken from
Mhm.
these mines um, and basically caves, and how that built up, like, England and the rest of Europe, and I was like, "Oh, that's sorta sad." Like, you see sometimes, I think, the end result, but, it's very human to not ask, like, "Oh, where did that money come from?" Like, how
Mhm.
are they all of a sudden able to build up things? And you realize it's from, you know, countries where your ancestors came from, and it's like, "Oh, that's an uncomfortable feeling to live with."
Yeah. And I think for me, it's also like really empowering because it's kind of like saying like how dare you look down on Latinos or how dare you say that like countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are poor or
Mm,
they're not politically stable, and when you really look at it it's like, well, why don't they have money, why do they struggle?
yeah,
The bigger question, and it's not because there's something wrong with them or they don't function well inherently, it's because of what's been done to them.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Alright, so what would you want people that identify as Latinx, Latino to get from this book?
My biggest goal is that I want people who are Latinx to just feel seen and to feel validated by
Mm,
this book, that this is something that can speak to their experience and that it helps them to make sense of some of what they've gone through. Because sometimes we don't have words for things and we kind of struggle with them, or we think like there must be something wrong with me or I'm a problem in some way. And then you read something that shows you, like, actually, a lot of people go through that and a lot of people feel that way. It's not just you. And these are some of the reasons why that happens. And I think it can be such a relief to know, right? It's not a me problem, but it's a bigger thing that can be really helpful. So I really hope that people can take from this and feel that in some way around some of the information. Um, and to just feel really affirmed, right? Like our culture is incredible and there's so much beauty and there's so much resilience and strength. And I
mhm,
hope that people are able to reconnect to certain aspects of our culture in a positive way because there's a lot of messaging, especially now, right, that puts us down and
yeah,
says that our culture is like bad or toxic. And it's not, right? There are, of course, things about it that we would want to change, but there's so much there that actually helps us to have more full lives and to have greater well-being.
yeah, exactly. Okay, so what do you want non-Latinx people to get from this book if they, happen to pick up this book and read it, which I hope they do. So, yeah.
Yeah. If somebody who's not Latinx picks it up, I would hope that it helps them to see that we are not just this monolith,
Mhm.
that the Latinx community is so diverse and we are multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual. We come from very many different parts of the world, not just Mexico.
Yeah.
We have been in the United States for many generations. Some of us have been here since before this was the United States. And
Mhm.
that we cannot be flattened to just these like stereotypes that people try to use to scapegoat us and to blame Latinos for problems. So most people, when they think of a Latino, they think like either like an immigrant or like a migrant worker. They think of labor, cheap labor, right? And like,
Mhm.
of course, that's part of our community, but we're also so much more beyond that. And a lot of times that's ignored or minimized.
Yeah.
we have a long lasting history on this continent and have contributed so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people are constantly surprised when I say, I'm like, yeah, I'm like third generation. My family's been here
Mm-hmm.
for a really long time. So, because, we all get that question. I hope people will stop asking this question. Like, where are you really from? I'm like, Texas? I don't know what to tell you. Like, so,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think this book is also just a really good, like, historical text as well that I mentioned earlier, is that people that are non-Latinx can honestly just understand their world a little bit better. Just understand,
Mm-hmm.
if there's books like this for every type of group, it's understanding how we all sort of intermingle. Like this whole idea of like division is just like a made up idea. It's like we've been intermingling and our ancestors' paths have crossed so many times for better or for worse that it's there. One country couldn't succeed without the other, and vice versa, or one country couldn't be harmed without the other, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back and forth. So yeah. All right. So can you describe your book in one sentence or two sentences if you need to?
I think if I was to describe the Latinx Guide to Liberation, I would say that it is a celebration of Latinx culture and resilience and strength and beauty, while also shining a light on some of the significant and difficult experiences we've gone through as a people.
Great sentence. All right. So what is next for Vanessa? What's going on after this? And also, where can people find you on social media, on the internet?
Yeah. You can find me on social media. So, like Instagram and TikTok, I'm at _trauma therapist. You can check out my website, which is longbeachtraumatherapy.com. And you can reach me through that as well if you ever want to reach out to me. I think what's next for me is I'm just really excited to see what happens now that this book is kind of alive and real in the world. For a
Yeah.
long time, it just felt like something that was like my own thing. And, I'm just kind of working on it late into the night. And now it's actually real. And to see people like you, like hold it in your hands is still kind of surreal. So I'm just excited to have conversations and talk to people and see what it is that they get out of it or how they relate to it. And I really want to just like live in that for a while and enjoy that.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining me today. And if you have any questions, anyone that's watching it, feel free to put those questions in the comments. You can reach out to Vanessa, like she said, and all of her contact info will be in the description box below. Thank you all for being here. Bye.
Thank you.